drive?
Good.
Miserable?
Kind of.
Yeah. I'll make, will you guys make sure he gets all the things that went around? So our little cancellation delay put us back in our papers as well, too, actually, I think, by at least one, which is fine. So this is actually, I think, the first time, since this is only our second time getting together, the first time we're going to do this particular process, which is to talk about the paper. So this is the Leopold paper. You guys have these reading discussion questions, too?
Yeah.
Too much stuff. We gotta wake it up. Wake up. Sorry, guys. Here we go. Okay. So I get the paper, and I'm interested in you guys reading the paper, and then I provide these discussion questions. But I want to reiterate this, and I think I mentioned this already. Like, these questions are really just for you to kind of read through and look at while you're reading the paper, and it provides this as a springboard for discussion. I usually start with the first question or two, or maybe some ones that I actually do want to talk about and cover. But if we talk about other stuff, that's perfectly fine with me. Like, my goal with these is not for us to sit and grind through these 8 questions and to get an answer. Like, not even a little bit. Okay, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm mostly just looking for a discussion for, half hour or so about the paper. And if it goes to other areas, cool, man. We'll follow it down that rabbit hole. If we lose our focus, we'll just come back to one of the questions. So I just want to make sure you're all aware of that. It's not like school, we're looking for the right answer, that sort of thing. I want to talk a little bit about Aldo Leopold, the paper author. You guys ever heard of Aldo Leopold before?
Not before this paper.
Not before the paper. He's an interesting person. He worked for the Forest Service. He was one of really the first generation of the classic foresters that started the Forest Service. He came in just a little bit afterwards in the 20s, in the teens. But some of the things that he's famous for was that he was one of the first people to really sort of, in a lot of ways, he was very sort of in line with the status quo, right? The people that were, full suppression and everything. But he was also one of the first people to actually sort of take a step back and intelligently look at what was going on and see and make determinations for himself whether he thought this is what we should be doing, And so he was sort of an early critic. So although he worked for the Forest Service early, he didn't necessarily just go right along with the flow. He worked mostly in the Southwest. He worked a little bit in California, but most of his work was in the Southwest. And the one thing that he's real famous for is he was an advocate and a major force behind the first Forest Service wilderness area, which I think was the first wilderness area, period. Which was the Gila, and it was a wilderness area in spirit before it wasn't named, because the Wilderness Act didn't happen until 1966. This is obviously well before that. So that's how long the Gila Wilderness has been around and has been managed as such. So that's sort of one of his legacy things. He didn't he didn't always agree with doctrine. This paper is an example of that, of him kind of sort of questioning some aspects of it, not quite understanding entirely. And then he ended up moving back to Wisconsin. He actually died on a fire, his neighbor's fire. He had a heart attack while helping to fight the fire. And he wrote this famous book called A Sand County Almanac, and it's sort of like these Silent Spring type books that are sort of held even to this day as these are like an environmental type book. So if you ever see a Sand County Almanac, that's what it is. And it's really a reflection of sort of like the natural world around him. So that's kind of his background, and a lot of people find inspiration in Aldo Leopold just because he was one of the first sort of like environmentalists, I guess you could say. But he came at it from a very practical standpoint. So, anyway, well, yeah, I know what the answer is. So we'll start with the first question just to get the conversation started, and this is just open. So in your readings, what are the parks that he described to exist in Southern California, in Southern Arizona? Did you guys pick up on what that was?
So it was, I mean, what I thought it was referring to is like the Prescott, Pono, Coronado, and Crook
Mm-hmm.
National.
You mean the units?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And all the ranges surrounding it.
And the ranges around it? No, he was trying to describe a vegetative. He was talking about those areas, and you're absolutely right about that. But he was using it in that like park-like setting. You guys have heard that, right?
Like the open
Type conversion. So.
Yeah, exactly. And he was talking. Yeah, so type conversion changed it away from that park setting. You guys, you've heard of that park-like setting? Have you heard of that term before, John? You guys, like, what does it refer to you guys that are more familiar with it?
It's like
open understory.
open understory and healthy canopy spacing.
Yes, which is what we're trying to manage to, right?
Right.
And like the Garner, you know that Garner Valley? That's what it's called, right?
Yeah, Garner.
With it's got that long needle pine. What is that, Jeffrey in there?
There's Jeffrey Pondo. There's a couple Pondo in there, but most of it's us planning all of it. And
True.
You also have the pinions that are actually in the eastern side, and the pinions start basically where our station is at Morris, up on the hill, but they're kind of
Cool.
hidden in there.
Yeah.
You have to really cut into the brush to find them.
Well, that's what they're trying to bring the Laguna back to, right?
It's exactly what they're trying to bring Laguna back to. And that's a good example of what that should look like. In a lot of areas, actually, we're having a lot of success up there. And hopefully we're going to go for it Thursday. This is that park-like setting. It's open, so easy to walk in there. That's what it's trying. So that's what he's trying to get to with this. And if you look at the pictures, and I've actually got a picture later in this presentation, that is sort of like what people visualize in their mind, and a lot of that early documentation talks about that's what those ponderosa pine forests, like, and you're talking about the Tonto, Carson, that's what they should be looking like from an ecological standpoint, from a fire regime standpoint, which is what we're talking about today. So that's actually what they're referring to. Where have you guys heard that term before, actually? I'm curious. Because he's using that term here. He's not saying park-like. He's like calling it a park. That's why it's a little different. But you guys know where you've even heard that before?
Briefing.
Like a briefing, like a burn briefing, or?
Well, when it's like a kind of leader's intent type, towards the end of the briefing, what are our objectives, what our end state's going to be,
Yeah.
what they kind of envision.
Rehab projects too.
Yeah.
Right, like forest rehab type projects. So it's interesting, you have this like one term, right, a park, and it elicits this image, and you just associate all these things on top of it, just naturally, right? Because you guys are firefighters. And that's, I want to tie that to what we're going to talk about today with fire regimes, because what you're doing in your mind by taking that one word park, and you're putting all your personal experiences on top of that, that's a way to simplify what's otherwise a very complex system, right? And just using a few words to describe something that's very broad in scale. So it's interesting to see these things that have been around for a long time. So that's good. Who wants to... actually, I forgot. This is what I like to do. I like to ask you guys what questions you want to answer in this. So I'll throw it out there. Who wants to take another question? It could be any.
Who was that one we were discussing over there? Sorry, any other questions?
Hit me.
So we were discussing question number. Yeah, it's not the question. I was looking for the answer area where we were. I think it's question number 5.
How did he compare and contrast the brush fields of Arizona and California?
Yeah, because so I found it on page 9 in the 3rd paragraph.
Okay.
And we were just kind of chuckling because he goes through and he gives this full-on big spiel, and then at the end of it he goes,
"There's no comparison."
Yeah, there's no comparison between the two.
So what does that mean to you, or what do you think? What is his point? Is he just not making a good point, or?
Well, it would appear, therefore, that the California tendency toward heavier grazing and the tendency in the southwestern district towards much lighter grazing are not inconsistent because the two regions are not comparable.
It's almost like he's trying to find that commonality between apples and oranges, and he realizes that.
But he says if you read the whole thing, he talks about how California, you know, whether his theory is wrong between Arizona or the California grazing policy is wrong, but he's talking about basically like in California, with what we have, there's less, I guess, material under the chaparral
Yes.
to burn versus what they have, and therefore they're incompatible, you know, but
They were
Yeah,
saying
it's
there's
more herb,
more
more-
duff and understory in California than in Arizona.
And it rains.
More rainfall.
more rainfall,
They were
that
talking
sort of
about
stuff.
the
Right.
vegetation. The rainfall.
Yeah, just that the brush fields is similar to the ecology of the Arizona brush field. It would appear obvious that either my Arizona theory or California theory of grazing policy is wrong. The point is there is no similarity. The rainfall in California brush fields is nearly twice of that of Arizona brush fields. The seasonal distribution is different, and from what I can learn, there's a great deal more duff and more herbs and other inflammable material under the California brush. It would appear, therefore, that the California tendency towards heavier grazing and the tendencies in the southwestern district towards much lighter grazing are not inconsistent because the two regions are not compatible or comparable.
Comparable, yeah. It's a hard sort of sentence to
To kind
untangle.
of, yeah, we were getting a chuckle out of it because he's seeing all this stuff about, well, you know, this and that and this and that, and then he goes, but, you know, in the end, it doesn't matter, you know. So we just thought it was.
But he's also
interesting.
talking about consistency. Which is
Well, yeah, because I
interesting.
mean, the question is, how did Leopold compare and contrast the brush fields of Arizona and
Yeah.
California?
They're not comparable.
They're not comparable.
I think that's probably the answer. Because what was the difference? You guys brought up moisture was one of the main differences, right?
So you're saying the moisture.
and the duff.
So. Similarities.
Time of rain.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's
There
right.
are more
Talking about
inflammable
seasonality of rainfall.
materials under the brush, and the rainfall amounts are more. In Arizona, there's more grass types and less water. By implementing grazing in the two regions, it would be more beneficial in California due to the materials than using it in Arizona because of the fact of these factors.
I want to talk about what you talked about, the moisture. Can you explain that a little bit? How did that affect things?
Well, the brush gets moisture at different times of year, so it's going to be the two, comparing Arizona to California, the brush will be in different stages
Mhm.
at different times of the year, which affects how you're going to treat it, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. And also, did he talk about the types of brush that were found?
Well, see, because California
A little bit.
is
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
drought and fire resistant, right? You know, for the most part.
Sure.
So, you know, when you do get a fire going, it's gonna obviously have to burn hotter and in order to progress. But I think what he was saying in the fact of just we have more herb and stuff like that. It's, you know, you end up with buckwheat, and buckwheat when it's, you know, fully saturated isn't going to burn very well.
Right.
It's going to smoke,
Right.
but it's not going to burn very well.
Yeah.
So it just depends on, you know, but if you turn around in August, when the buckwheat, you can see, you know, and the whites turn brown, and you know that you're going to get movement out of it. So it's just dependent on what time of year, obviously, like any place, you know, because in July, in Arizona, you're going to get more of the monsoonal. When you get lightning, you know, depending on whether it's dry or wet,
Yeah. Well, that's what Adam was talking about.
but it's different flows, you know, on flows. And
It's almost different too, because the monsoon was a lot in a short amount of time. Well, this is leading into the other question that he talks about too, though, which is about the role of grass, and that was a very important part of this whole paper. So somebody else want to take a stab at that one and kind of wrap the grass situation into what we're talking about here.
I kind of found it interesting because, you know, the website FEIS, you can pretty
Yep.
much type in any type of species and it shows the significance and the role and the ripple effect it has in the ecosystem. And then go figure, grass has an essential role in ecology. And then what I kind of took from it, my takeaway, if you will, was it has its main purpose is to have root competition with the brush. That way it doesn't so easily type convert, and then also preventing erosion. You know, I never really took too much interest. I mean, I've only been here about 8 months, but I never took too much interest into hydrology. I think for me it was more, you know, the whole ecosystem and how everything has its function. But you know, and then it goes into talking about the watersheds, how, you know, I guess it brought a different aspect of how I view our agency as land managers, because you know, I never saw the significance and the value in a watershed, in the water system, for instance. Remember, we're in Arizona by the Roosevelt Dam. We were staging there, and then we were just taking a bunch of pictures, but go figure, you know, I didn't realize that that dam, there's so many other programs tied into it that have a ginormous value in the economy. You know, so it kind of just brought a different aspect to me, just the role of the grass, how it I guess creates a whole lot of revenue for other programs, and as land managers, I guess that's what we're trying to protect against, you know, the erosion and keep our watersheds clear so that the water keeps flowing.
One of the interesting takes from that paper too, though, was that he basically talks about, you know, the grasslands and how the brush is encroaching, and how when he talked to other people, how they remembered it being tons
The old timers.
the old timers,
Yeah.
40 years prior or whatever, that it used to just be grass and all this. But one of the things that he was kind of stating was that they said that that was the way that the natural state was, but that was the state when it was being managed by Indians and being burned off and lightning and all that.
Or you
Just-
didn't have the heavy grazing.
you didn't have the heavy grazing as well, but it was, he said, so how do we know that that is the way that was the peak of what it was?
So the climatic, I forget the verbiage, we're talking about the climax, we're talking about
Yeah,
the woodland areas.
The vegetative climax.
Yeah, when, you know, who knows that before the Indians and all that, whether it was brush, and that the brush, that's the way it's supposed to be, and that's the climactic, was that basically, like, it was left untreated, it would be brush. And that when the Indians came in and treated it, now you had the grass. You know, and that by maintaining that treatment, that's what maintained the grass. And then when you change those treatments, now the brush was taking back what it initially had. I guess is kind of what he was going for.
He was talking about basically, and where do we deal with this now, right? There's landscape changes and those differences based upon human inputs. We talked about the indigenous management of it, but so he's in 1920, looking back 40 years, that's 1880. Is 1880 pretty, I mean, is that like a natural condition on the landscape in the Southwest? I
Compared
mean,
to today, yeah.
Well,
compared to today, maybe, yeah,
Yeah.
obviously compared to today, but had there been a lot of management going on by
Mhm.
1880?
yeah, because the Indians, right?
Well,
Is what they were talking about?
even before that, though, or after them, though, who'd been on the landscape for almost 200 years by 1880? The Spanish?
Spanish were bringing non-indigenous species too.
They were bringing non-indigenous species, and what was the main land utilization of the Spanish?
Cattle.
Grazing. Yeah, so grazing had been a huge part of the Southwest by that time for a couple hundred years even.
So if they were treating the area so that they got better grazing land,
Well, they didn't care about anything
it would
other
eliminate the
than,
brush,
yeah,
and now the brush is just trying to take back kind of what it owned
yeah,
initially.
yeah.
Is kind of what I got out of that.
I would agree with that. Grazing is, people talk about fire suppression as being one of the main drivers of vegetative change, and in many places like here it is, but a lot of places like the Southwest, grazing is actually one of the main drivers because it removes that fire. The Great Basin, actually, there is so much grazing in the Great Basin. It is affecting the sagebrush and the juniper ecosystems. I think I talked about this a little bit before, where the district I worked on the Sawtooth had the highest level of grazing anywhere in the Great Basin, right? So it was just all over the place. And then what was happening was the juniper, it's the same thing he talks about here, where the juniper was encroaching. What's the mechanism for that? Which talks to the grass.
Yes.
It's conversion.
So the cows eat the grass, right?
Yeah, but it's
No
no
fires, no
competition.
connector for fire.
That's right. No fires happen after that, right? The connectors, there are no connectors. And so is that a natural, that's obviously not necessarily, you're talking about succession? What is the success? That's why a lot of people don't really believe in successional theories, which, have we talked about that? We're going to talk about it today. You guys know what that is? Have we talked about that? Successional theory, where you start with dirt, and then what comes up first? Do trees just erupt?
Pioneer plant.
Pioneer species is the term they talk about. So the pioneer, the first person, the most hardy of, or I guess you could look at rock even, if you really wanted to look at it. You start with the lichens and the mosses, and then they break down the rocks, they create dirt, you get little grasses and little forms that come in. They die, create more dirt, and enough to get bigger grass, and then brush, and then eventually trees. That's sort of the classic succession theory, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here. And some people believe in that, and in some places it probably works. But I think people are starting to think more and more that there's no real defined curve, and it really is just the inputs, and it's the disturbances, which is what he's talking about. Anyway, I just want to make the point that grazing is really a huge impact, and you got to look at that when you look at the landscape and try to know what's going on. Anyway, sorry. Well, let's move on. Who wants to take another question if we got time? Yeah, 9:30. Yeah, we got time for at least another one. Any other part that you found interesting on this, or whether it be addressing one of these questions or not? I especially love, by the way, you guys talking about, hey, what was that question we were talking about in the car? Those are the ones I definitely want you to bring up, or thinking about yourself.
Well, this one I kind of was in a myth about was number 8. Since the time of this writing, what changes would you expect to occur in that landscape?
Oh, okay, great one. You were miffed about it?
Well, yeah, it's like, well, I don't know what they've done since then.
Yeah, did they continue grazing or did they
Yeah,
stop grazing?
so basically what I put was I would suspect that they limited or controlled grazing if the grasses, brush transition and incorporated prescribed fire to control or limit fire damage to the forest. As to the watershed, not sure how they handled the erosion issues other than controlling grazing and seeding natural grasses in the areas of heavy erosion. Overall, creating a landscape that best benefits the pre-settlement and post-settlement days.
Okay.
I mean, but I have no idea what they do.
No, you're
Forest
right.
Service I don't know
Okay,
what they're doing out there is.
Well, it changes so many times too, because
Yeah.
it's like, you have someone new running the agency, and now they have different goals, different perspectives of how they want it to be, and so they change their format, and then you're looking at how many years, how often do they change, management.
Well, there's a great point in both of this. I hear you. Obviously, there's not enough information to know. I think the question was really mostly just speaking to, your expertise. You're driving through the area and looking around, even if it's a windshield or maybe you wouldn't caught fire there. And if you've never been in the Southwest in those areas, then maybe you couldn't answer the question. It's unfair. So I'll give you that one. But I think the question is really, is a great point. I want to try to get to this other one, but it's just what do you know about the policies? What do you know about what we've been doing? We know we've been fighting fire. We know that, we've been evolving our fire management policies to allow more fire. We know what we're trying to get to restoration of those ecosystems. You know all that stuff. So maybe it's not a fair question. But I think what you wrote, though, is all the possibilities that have occurred, right? You were talking about prescribed fire implementation, trying to get to those ecosystem services, the benefits of it. So I think that's a fair answer.
I don't think it's an unfair question. I just, I really didn't know, because I've never been in that area.
Okay.
So
Well,
I don't know
He's
what.
used to concrete,
Yeah, that's right.
the concrete
I
jungle.
mean, I worked in Arizona for a while in Yuma, and it was totally different.
And that's totally different ecosystem, yeah. And there's crazy stuff going on in the desert too. With the what is it called, the buffalo grass? You guys heard of that?
Yeah, the buffalo grass.
Yeah. Okay, so the other point, the real point though, and all of this, and which you spoke to as well, was the fact that there's changes over time. You talk about administrations. So, again, you started with, first before any people were there, and the native people came in, they did their management. We talked about that last time. And then, of course, the Spanish came in. Would you call that a management regime? Do you remember, you guys ever heard that story where the viceroy or whatever in San Diego declared no fires? Like, it was the first fire ban?
All fires out or something?
Yeah, for sure. Like, why was that? You know why?
Because they were burning off for grazing land, right? Because then the grass would come in, and then they'd be able to.
Well, I think the opposite. They didn't want fire. They didn't want to let fires burn the grazing land. So they were trying to protect the grass crop that was there. I don't think they had a very vast understanding of, you know, the ecological interactions. They just saw fire is going to burn something, it's going to burn the grass first. If the grass is burned, then the cattle can't roam. So that was the reason for that fire ban a couple hundred years ago, and people were punished severely for like setting fires and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, so that's a management strategy. And then the Spanish faded off, and then it just kind of went back. It kind of reverted back to just whatever. And then you started having miners come in and loggers, and then the grazing came in, and that had an effect. And then you had the Forest Service or, you know, BLM. So, you know, it's always this constant evolution. And so your point about like it depends on, like, it's almost like the flavor of the month for what affects the land. And that's one of the things that amuses me the most. And I think it's just such an amazing point, is that we're very tied to, like, right now, I've already about the Forest Service example, but we're really tied to the Forest Service and what we're doing. And we think that, you know, we've only been there since, what, 1908?
Knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, it is really. It's not necessarily like we think we're taking the long view, but we're not really taking the long view, are we? Not really. We're not contextualizing against the last 400 years of management.
A lot of cultural and political pressure because of that.
And is political pressure long term?
No.
No. Like, in what spans of years are you looking at political pressures?
Yeah, like tens of years.
Yeah, exactly. If even that.
Versus an ecosystem that's survived for millions or, you know, at least thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm not gonna, like, this might come across as cynical, but like, I love what we do. I think what we're doing is correct, but in the end, nature always wins, right? So we have to respect that, and we have to truly, I personally think what we do and why we're here in this class is the more we can understand about any system, whether it be a forest or a desert or whatever that we're operating in, if we're going to be a part of it, the more we understand about it, the more we can provide those management actions where needed. Because we don't always need to have them, right? But the more we know about it. I always talk about the G.I. Joe principle, which you guys are all familiar with, right? The G.I. Joe principle? Really? You guys never watched G.I. Joe in the 80s?
Yeah.
What did they say
You're
at
a
the
real
end?
American hero?
Well, no, that's the thing. Well, that too. That's why you're a fireman or whatever. No, knowing is half the battle. Come on. Remember they always did like the little moral thing at the end about Cobra Commander was doing drugs or something, and Commander Duke came in and saved him, took the joint out of his mouth. Whatever. All right, is there anything else you guys want to talk about with that Owl Leopold paper?
I think I might have something worth mentioning. I'd like to hear your take on it. I once heard, you know, and bringing it back to the park-like setting, goal or end state, if you will. I once heard that, you know, like slash and duff and masticating, for instance, it's a good way to recycle the nutrients back into the soil, or even like with a broadcast burn, you know, you burn it and all the nutrients go back into the soil.
Yeah.
And then I think it was in Europe that they do a lot of raking, if you will, and then they pretty much pick up, you know, all the understory and then remove it, and that's why they have the real park-like setting, if you will. And I know it's probably not feasible to manage a whole forest like that, but when it comes to like field breaks and defensible spacing around the mountain communities, do you think that would be a management strategy?
To literally just go out there and pick up the wood?
Yeah, and maybe take it to a dump site or something, or maybe burn it somewhere else, you know, like create, I don't know.
But then you're removing, right, or was it, you'd be removing like carbon, stuff like that. They think that the carbon helps with
Urban habitat.
Natural habitats
you know.
too.
Yeah, well, there's the, yeah, man, there's so much to that question.
But like in a field break, your goal is to keep all the vegetation down, and you don't necessarily want it to come back.
But would you remove it or would you burn it? So like if you did like a prescribed burn and burned it off and then did that periodically, then you're keeping the nutrients with the soil instead of removing that can affect what other growth or...
That's what promotes
What's the
regrowth. I mean, you see it all the time. We burn like Thomas Mountain, Unit 17A.
But if we burned it more often, would that change it from, you know,
Yeah.
you're providing more new growth versus dead and down and all that other
But
stuff?
even with the fuel breaks, I think there's still an element of some type of ecological impact or benefit of those field breaks. I
Mhm.
mean, that's why they do that whole NEPA process and proposals, project proposals and so forth, right?
Yeah, NEPA is to evaluate the effects.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily, and we're going to talk about this in some detail, but it's to mitigate those two effects to a degree, but you're not going to be able to mitigate all the effects. In other words, you're not going to be able to both cut something down and leave it. You need to decide which one you're going to do and then describe the effects. Did you say something back there?
Oh, I was just talking, if you burned it too much, it would probably cause erosion issues, especially when you get a storm right afterwards or something like that.
Exactly, trade-off, which, yeah, we just said.
Yeah.
Exactly. You guys are dancing all around it, which is the objectives. You have to look at the objectives of it. There was a lot to what you asked about that. You were talking about European forestry. A lot of that's a matter of scale. And it's also, a lot of those ecosystems in the northern latitudes don't burn as often. A lot of them are like those short needle pines and firs and things like that. So, and it actually is a strategy we do in some areas, like up on the, you always use that example, and Fry Creek as well too. We're actually going and like gathering the excess dead and down and putting it in piles, trying to get rid of it. We are trying to do that, but we're trying to do that not for the sake of doing that, but for the sake of trying to return it to a characteristic fuel loading. It's trying to get it to what should be on the ground. And our process, all of our land management plans in Southern California and other places where you have timber requires there to be dead and down logs, right? You were talking about that coarse woody debris, it's called. So you have to keep, like, I can't remember, 4 tons per acre of dead and down wood. That's for invertebrates and habitat and nutrient recycling. The whole nutrients thing, I wouldn't worry too much about that. First of all, carbon is like the most abundant nutrient. So like there's almost never a lack of carbon. And then a lot of the most important nutrients, primarily nitrogen, when it burns, it gets volatilized off into the atmosphere anyway. So a little bit of it precipitates out locally, but a lot of the nitrogen inputs that you get from, actually, do you know where most of the atmospheric nitrogen comes from? Nitrogen is like the most important nutrient for plants, just for the record. Do you know where most of it comes from? Like almost all of it? You guys ever heard of this? It's actually is created by lightning. Lightning bolts, and then that superheated air actually creates nitrogen. It's called atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So the nitrogen that you're getting on site was always coming from somewhere else. There isn't really this, I mean, to a degree there isn't this like sort of like cycle that goes on the land. It's stuff goes up, stuff comes down from elsewhere. And then a lot of, like, if you just like masticate it, it actually locks up nitrogen, unfortunately. So if you get a lot of, we talked about that, wood chips, or if you chip, you can't chip too much in a site because it actually, as it decomposes, it locks up that nitrogen and it binds it, so the plants can't actually access it. So burning is a lot of times the best method because it puts it up in the air and then it deposits it somewhere else and it just counts on, your buddy doing the same thing down the road. So that kind of speaks to the nutrient thing. So the whole, like, if you were to just pick it up, it really wouldn't have much of an effect locally. It would actually have more of an effect somewhere else downstream, downwind. Make sense? So it's complicated, man. Land management is very complicated. That's why I believe, and most people believe, that you try to restore these natural processes, these characteristic processes, as we're going to talk about, as much as possible, in as many places as possible. Did everyone follow that? It's a good question. It's a very good question, actually. Thanks for asking it. Are we good? All right, let's move on to the lectures then. Anybody need like a quick break or anything? I'll give you 5 minutes if you want to do some coffee. We'll do a little bit of some lecture action. Or we can just get started. I'm going to get a little more coffee though. All right, well, I'm going to get... Yeah. Go ahead.
I looked into that, what we discussed on the phone,
Yeah?
and it would take me like 2 years because of all of the political aspects to even get close to implementing something like that with that Good Neighbor agreement, just because of all the conflicts that are going on.
Who did you talk to?
So I talked to Well, I talked to Ahern, I talked to Fogel, I talked to Freddie, I talked to Garth, and Freddie tried to work on that a little bit, and then trying to implement between the council, CAL FIRE, Idaho Fire, the Forest Service.
Yeah.
Then I'd have to contact Jaime and get approval, Nobles get approval, O'Connor get approval, and then the homeowners, because the way that the council works, the homeowners are responsible for 25% of the cost, and dealing with their land, with the council removing,
Yeah.
and then, so they would be responsible for paying that. The council deals with a bunch of grants and agreements and whatever, so there's always money shifting.
Yeah, they get a lot of money that just kind of comes from different
And-
sources. Yeah.
And it would be, you could probably eventually set something like that up, but the problem is that Goodwill Neighbor Authority expires September 30th of 2018.
The Good Neighbor Authority does?
Yeah,
Oh, I didn't know that.
and it's only good between state and federal. And the problem is that CAL FIRE says that whole area is theirs, but Idaho Fire actually is responsible for that area because they have their whole agency set up.
Yeah.
And so then I end up with them butting heads over who's responsible for it, who's not.
And my understanding is that those entities butt heads quite a bit. I'm talking to, who's that BC up there?
Freddie Boss.
No, not your BC, the Idaho BC.
Oh, you're talking Lamont?
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah,
Mark.
yeah. They butt heads all the time.
I
And
like
so,
listening to him explain.
so trying to get something like that through would take longer than the agreement, before the agreement expires, and even to get it to a completion state where you actually put some sort of fire on the ground,
Yeah.
just the political hoops that would be involved in trying to get through it are just massive.
So, are you going to retool a little bit then? You want to talk about another direction, or?
Yeah, we were talking about working in a group
Okay.
for a project.
All right, cool.
So in that way, it's for one person to try to go that route with all those aspects involved, and then you have to have somebody there to mitigate the piles, and you have to have somebody there, to monitor, you know what I mean? It was just like, all the NEPAs that have to be gone through, and
Yeah.
which was kind of cool, is which I wanted to do, is to kind of get my hands in, more of that planning aspect, and I just think it's going to be beyond my capability.
You know what? Yeah, that gives me an idea. Let's table that for a break so we can talk about it in more detail. But remember, this whole thing is about exploration anyway. So if you come across some, you wanted to do something and you find an obstacle, and that in and of itself is part of the learning. You know what I mean? So there might be, I don't have to think about that, but there might be a way to capture that in a tangible manner. Because if we find things that are too much of a problem or too onerous or too lengthy, then that in and of itself has value. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So, chew that over. Or you can go to the group project, either way.
I'm more confused.
You're more confused. No, what I'm saying is, like a lessons learned sort of thing. Like you can always write up a lessons learned. But I want to talk about that stuff more individually. Although it's a good thing for everybody, but
Yeah, now under the old agreement, it would have been easier because you're allowed to deal with, that expired back in 2008 or something like that, and the old agreement stated that you could deal with private, local, federal, state, it gave you more of a gamut in order to get buy-in to deal with it.
yeah.
And then this one is more only state and federal.
For the GNA. There's actually a training like later this month, 30th or something. Yeah, it's actually the 30th.
I mean, if you go in, because it's under Section B, is the one that allows you to do that,
Okay.
but it only is between state and federal. And if state says they own the land, but while Idaho Fire says no, it's ours, now you're going to have that conflict of especially dealing around homes, and then you have to get the buy-in from the owners in order to even do it.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, guys, let's get started. Believe me, I could just talk all morning. So but I do want to get started on this. This is we're going to talk about Unit 2 here, so fire and ecosystems. This talk doesn't quite. It talks a little bit about fire ecology, probably less than I would like. But you got to remember too that part of remember going back to part of the reason for doing this class was to give you guys educational materials that you're not going to get somewhere else. So in a class like RX 310, which is the fire effects class that I teach, which you guys should all be taking if you haven't taken it already. I know some of you have. That's what we'll be talking a lot more about, fire ecology and fire effects. So to me, it's absent in this discussion, but I just know you're going to get it in other places, and we're going to be talking about it continually. Does that make sense? So we're mostly going to be talking about fire regimes, and condition classes and things like that, and how to measure it, how it's metric, which you don't get as much in other places. So, just to preface it, we are going to talk about some concepts of fire ecology and ecology just in general. I know you guys have all heard about it and probably understand. We're going to look at concepts of a few different concepts and talk about definitions, fire regimes. You guys heard of fire regime? I know we've talked about it already. A little bit? Okay. Well, hopefully you'll have a much better understanding of fire regimes, especially it's an extremely important concept, especially as you look to sort of include the understanding of fire regimes into management actions and your actions on the ground. Condition classes, fire regime departures, and some other discussion points as well too. Then we're going to explain the roles of regimes, condition classes, all this in fuels management. We'll talk about that a little bit more. All right, so let's get started. So talk about ecosystems. I know you guys have you hear a lot about ecosystems. You hear a lot about ecology, but just to break it down to its fundamentals. What an ecosystem is, this is a definition. It specifically refers to living organisms, okay? So it's not talking about the dead things, but it's talking about the living organisms and how they interact with the non-living components of it. So you got the birds, you got the mice, the deer, whatever, and then it's not just them, it's talking about their habitat, it's talking about the water, it's talking about the air, it's talking about the trees, it's all of it and how they interact. And that's sort of like just the broadest scale definition of ecosystems, or what an ecosystem is. You know, it's an area and how everything is living with each other. The definition of ecology, of course, is just the study of that. It's the study of living organisms and the relationships that they have with their environment. So mostly you're looking at how, you're not necessarily looking at the environment as much, you're mostly looking at the organisms that are associated with it. But in ecology these days, you're really just looking at the whole ecosystem as a whole, or the ecosystem as a whole. And because the environment is so complicated, like we talk about a lot, there's very few people that try to truly understand and try to truly study all of it at once. And like most things in science, you start to get differentiations, you start to get specialties. So you get these areas of ecological study, like wildlife ecology. Have you guys ever heard of like a wildlife ecologist or like a fire ecologist, a plant ecologist? You know, this is because this person who is a plant ecologist is not as excited about wildlife or fire. They're interested in plants. And plants just by themselves is a super complicated. So you're probably going to have somebody that might be like a tropical plant ecologist or like a grassland plant ecologist, you know, or maybe a generalist. So it gets very quickly broken down. And then of course you have fire ecology, which is not a large field, but what do you think fire ecology would mostly be studying? Don't just say fire.
Just effects.
The effects of what? The effects of fire?
Yeah, and what they are on
other ecologies.
the areas.
Yeah. I mean, it's taking that same environment, right, and the living organisms, and they're looking at how it deals with when that environment is on fire, both pre, right, and then post fire, which would be also called fire effects. Right? So how bad, or what happens after a fire burns through. So that's what a fire ecologist do. And of course, a lot of fire ecology study is trying to figure out, you know, how do we reintroduce fire in areas where we need it to be reintroduced? How do we, or maybe what the effects of too much fire is. A lot of the fire ecology in Southern California is actually looking at the effects of too much fire. We've talked about that, right, where chaparral is having too many fire return intervals. And what's the result of that?
conversion.
Ventura County with the 101 getting shut down.
Yeah, that too, but also type conversion. That's effect. So type conversion, you're getting it's sort of like a reverse of succession, right? This is a great example. You got grass moving to brush to trees. What happens with too much fire?
Moves to
Those
grass.
trees move to brush, moves to grass. That's a disturbance, and we're going to talk about disturbance versus successional theory. But so hold that in your mind, pin that. I think the kids say, and we'll come back to it. But so that's fire ecology. Of course, fire is just one process of, or one component of an ecosystem. That's right. We talk about it right now. It's traditionally been seen as a disturbance, right? So what's a disturbance? You guys understand what a disturbance is in an ecosystem?
Like a change.
Like a what?
A change.
Breaking the normal process.
It is a change. It's a break in the normal process. It's usually something that's acute, though. It's a disturbance. Like the Death Star exploding. It's like an acute action. So what are some acute actions that might be on the landscape that changes something, that creates that change you're talking about? And don't say fire, because obviously fire.
Maybe a certain species that was in that ecosystem.
That's an interesting, yeah, that's a good one, actually. Yeah, you could get carp or something, like Asian carp to
Or
come in.
if you took cattle out of grazing land, what would happen?
Yeah, that would be a disturbance as well, too. Yeah. And you're talking about temporal scale there, too, right? So some of it happens quicker than others. But that definitely is a disturbance. That's a good
And
point.
you would get the species pushing out into other areas, because I know in a couple cases, like they've seen turkey now in Garner Valley. They think they pushed out of the Cleveland, out of the Garner. And then I remember because I used to live in Malibu, we had a bunch of parrots.
Parrots, yeah, okay. What did they do to
pushed
the
in.
ecosystem?
When they had the big fires, the parrots pushed in, and we'd never had them before, and now we had these green parrots running around all around the house. And
Did they affect the ecosystem? Do you know?
well, that's unknown. I mean, but from
But
being
that's
a kid,
that's the question, though.
from being a kid and seeing maybe like 4 of them to older in age and seeing 30 of them, that effect that obviously they're producing, they're increasing in numbers, and what effect is that going to have on their food sources? And
Well, what do you think the effect of like a new species being in? Like, what are the effects of new wildlife species coming into an area?
Coming into it, look at Hawaii.
What's that?
Look at Hawaii. It dramatically affects their food chain.
Mm-hmm.
It could replace the indigenous species. It could wipe out entire species. It could wipe out entire ecosystems. Look what humans are doing to the world.
We're doing great, man. And so not only the introduction of species, but what else? The removal of a species can have an effect as well, too, right? Especially top of the food chain. And we talked about the wolf thing, right? Yeah. So.
What about like logging and like housing development and that kind of stuff? I mean, is that possible, depending?
I think it could be, certainly could be a disturbance. It's almost like logging, definitely a disturbance. Housing that's more like a change. That's just like a transition.
yeah,
I
but
would say, because a disturbance is something that it happens, and then obviously another action happens in that same area. Housing is just going to be a house,
but
I guess, unless you want to look at the long term.
but if you look at it as okay, I have my house and now I'm required to have so much clearance. Now I've created a disturbance in that area, right?
Well, but that's a singular disturbance to what that effect is. All right, I want to take it back to the original question, though. So all these things are accurate, but what are some other ones that are more classical examples?
About a flood.
I wouldn't call drought that. I think
Climate
that's
change?
more climactic. That's an interesting question, though. I'm not going to say no for sure on that, but I don't think so.
Climate change?
Same thing as drought. I think that's more. I don't necessarily see that as an acute. That's more of a chronic.
Well, it's acute because it can happen over, like, let's look at natural climate change. Happens over, possibly millions of years.
Yeah.
So you have all these species adapting to that over a millennia.
But acute means like all at once, as opposed to chronic, which is
Okay.
the longer.
Then you could human accelerated climate change.
Again, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with it, because I do think it's a disturbance. I'm just talking about things like, say, a landslide.
Oh, okay.
You know?
So more
I'm
on a
talking
small
like
scale?
acute, man.
Okay.
Yeah, like super acute. Although, like I said, your point is well made.
Yeah.
Like these are changes.
Earthquake, I don't know.
Yeah, earthquake, a fire, hurricane, tornado, typhoon, things that just go in and like cause there to be a change, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the character of the landscape, right? So it might change it for a while, but if it was a pine forest and a hurricane came through and blew down half the trees, that's a disturbance. It's going to be different, but it's still going to be a pine forest in 100 years. A lot of these climate and drought type things, like probably, actually we know for sure that there's going to be vegetative changes, or maybe where there were trees, it's going to revert back to brush. And that is a interesting topic unto itself because we don't really know what those effects are going to be. But anyway, so let's go back to this then. Fire had been seen as a disturbance. Fire had been seen as something that was not a normal part of the landscape, right? So a tornado or say an avalanche, those aren't things, I mean, they happen, but they're not like something that normally happen across the large areas. It's not something that's seen as important. Let's say that. It's not something that's seen as important. So fire for a long time is not seen as something that's important. But now we're trying to evolve our views and seeing it as a what we call a process. It's something that is inherent to the ecosystem. And all these things are inherent to the ecosystem, right? They're a natural part of it. And it's not sort of like the end of the world. Before, fire was really seen as like, oh God, we can't have fire in it because it's just going to ruin everything. And that was a very short scale view of fire. Now we're like, yeah, there's going to be a fire. There's going to be a fire eventually. Like we all say that, right? There's going to be a fire everywhere at some point. That's because we've all evolved our views, and you have all evolved your views, if they ever were like disturbance, which they probably weren't. We've all viewed now culturally to see fire and most ecosystem-based things as a process. So here's the question: why does fire ecology get so much study, do you think?
Because it's bound to come back no matter what, being that we live in a Mediterranean ecosystem. It's a part of the natural element.
Yeah, fire is definitely a big part of it. Here, but fire is a big part of the landscape in a lot of places, right? And I think, yeah, go ahead.
And then the shift, like you're saying, in fire being a process and not a disturbance is new enough where it's trying to catch up with the rest of the, study elements as far as it being, a legitimate science versus just.
Yeah. I actually had not thought about that. That is a really good point, and I think it's very accurate. 'Cause how long has fire ecology as a concept been around versus, like, say, plant ecology? Yeah, hundreds of years, right, for plant ecology, plant functioning. Yeah, probably just in the last 30 years or so would fire ecology be seen as a discipline. So that's a very good point. There's no real answer to this. It's just a question. So we talk about this a lot, and we're going to talk about it more. Ecological functioning. What does ecological functioning mean? You guys have a concept of what that means? Ecological functioning. So we know what ecological means. What's functioning mean?
It all works together.
That works together. What was that?
So how it's supposed to function without, like, how we see the natural aspect of it.
Yeah, the natural aspect of it, how it's supposed to be. Yeah. And it could also be how it just is, how it exists. But we're always trying to get to proper, we always put that adjective, or it's an adjective, right? Proper ecosystem functioning, because there's a recognition.
Yeah, versus the process of the disturbance, what we're affecting.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're trying to understand what is the functioning of the ecology. Is it normal? Is it good? Because what do we do as humans? We always want to try to fix things, right? So we want to try to understand what the proper functioning is, what it should be naturally, which we're not going to.
Then is a part of that left to interpretation of those interpreting what that?
Well, you answer your own question, man. What do you think?
Well, it is. So I mean,
Well, I look at that way as his answers as fire.
Yeah.
How long has fire been studied?
So what are you trying to say then? You think that? So you're saying that ecological functioning and the concept of it is new. So you're saying, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Everything before that is what we're trying to understand. like everything with fire in ecology, and we're still trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Do you think we have figured it out?
We're still studying that. It's trying to find that balance of that fire ecology or fire in the ecosystems.
Well, we need to figure out the Darwin theory first.
What was that great? Do you say just put it all out?
I mean, technically, fire ecology goes back farther, right? Because basically the Indians were doing it, right? They used fire for a lot of stuff, and they had to go through that process to figure out what was going to damage and what was going to, have a good effect on.
A process of understanding. Yeah.
Trying to make it the best we can make it.
Do you think we should?
Yeah.
I think just let it go. And see.
We could. Well, there's a lot of people that are advocating that position. Actually, a lot of the environmentalist types really think that we should just stop trying because we can't actually understand. Like, there's no way that humans could understand
Within this long.
without us.
More information to study from.
Yeah.
If we just let it go and see what it actually is.
Were you making a joke? Did you say something about just put the fires out?
No, I.
Oh, I thought you just said that. Actually, I was going to say it's. I mean, that's one option, right? And in some places, it's actually probably the best option still in many ways, which we talked about last time, right? Remember, we're just not ready for fires to be reintroduced into ecosystems. So suppression is still a tool. We can't forget that. But where do we make those judgments, right? How does that fit into ecological functioning? Lance, what are you saying? I'm sorry.
So that places like Lake Isabella should be 100% suppression because it's already been type converted and it's trying to recover back to its original state.
Yeah, exactly. 100% agree. And I also believe Southern California is that way. I think you guys have heard me say it, right? I always say fire engines are a tool of ecological restoration in Southern California. We should have a large fire suppression standpoint because we have too much fire here. We want to avoid that type conversion. And I'm the biggest advocate for wildland fire use. Trying to restore fire to the ecosystems is what I'm doing my dissertational work on. But here, we should be putting fires out. And anybody that thinks otherwise doesn't properly understand ecological function as we understand it. Anyway, all right, sorry, good question. All right, here's just a picture. I don't do too many pictures, so this is one of the few pictures you get in this class. So enjoy it. It's very pretty. So ecosystem. Actually, it's funny, the other instructors like Garth and Dan, they put pictures throughout, so it's always probably much more enjoyable. It cracks me up. I'm just too lazy to go get pictures. So this is just this is just a diagram of an ecosystem. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here. So the big black circle around the biggest one is the ecosystem, and it's just showing how you can get smaller and smaller, right? So the big ecosystem includes moisture, right? Solar radiation, disturbances, of course it has fire there, it's a disturbance. Not a process, interestingly enough. Soil organisms, trees, plants, water, and then you can get into a habitat. So what's a habitat? It's smaller than an ecosystem, right? So what would you think a habitat would be? There you go. I know you all have heard the term.
A creek?
It could be a creek, but what is a habitat?
A community in which everything deals together. So, like, the animals that live in the area eat the fish, and the fish eat the bugs, and the trees support the shading from the sun and allow other things to be able to live. And
I think you're describing an ecosystem there, though, because you're talking about multiple aspects of it.
but it's for a specific area.
Yeah, for specific animals or.
Yeah, that's the specificity is for
So-
a habitat.
so would
you're
that
really
be-
talking about like.
So would that be more like an oasis out off of the, like out in the desert? You have, because the
What lives
tectonic
in-
plates, and you have the water coming up, and now you have small fish. And
What lives in
palm
those
trees,
oases, though?
birds and small animals and.
Small animals. And they
Specific
only
types.
live there?
Specific types of plants, animals.
Yeah, specific. So I would say that would be a habitat, but it's probably for very specific things just to that area. So yes, absolutely, that's what a habitat is. That's what you guys are saying, which is that it's really specific to, and there might be more than one thing that uses that habitat, but habitat really does describe what that species needs to have. So fish, their habitat is water. Is their habitat land? It doesn't. No, because it doesn't have what it needs. Fish don't live on land because fish need water. That's their habitat.
Kind of like a fish tank.
Yeah, exactly. You're creating a habitat. Aren't they called a habitat?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You're creating the environment in which they live. You couldn't throw a, I don't know, an aardvark in that fish tank, right?
Right.
It's not their habitat. We were just talking aardvarks at home, that's why that's salient, in case you're wondering. Difference between an aardvark and an anteater, is there? These are the questions you get from your 12-year-olds.
Probably.
Probably. Wikipedia, son. And then a community, which is also what kind of you described, which is like a collection of species.
Well, and then too, habitats aren't 100% self-supporting either.
Oh, why would you say that?
Well, like if you think of a fish tank as a habitat, you have to intervene to make sure it stays, suitable for that. So the whole ecosystem provides for a habitat.
No, you're
it has
absolutely
to
right.
import. The habitat has to import things from other places in the ecosystem.
You're kind of like God of that
Right.
habitat. Because you're providing the food.
Right.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a great point, which is that, yeah, this is relying upon water that might come from way over there, right? And it's certainly relying on the sun. It's not self-photosynthesizing. It is relying upon all those things. Yeah, this is interesting. So is the house like the ecosystem of the... Man, you just blew my mind, Rick Bowen. Good job, man. I love it. What's up, Charles? And then this is just another diagram that talks about cycling, right? So this is principle of cycling, which we talked about a little bit. I know, I hate this chart too. Whenever you see a chart like this, like take a breath. Like this is what I always do. I was just like, I hate these things. Take a breath. And then just start with one of them. So I'm going to start with this, soil. And then you can just break this down. So, okay, what does it say? Soil, the big ones, forest, floor, understory plants, animals. Where does this go? Okay, soil, roots are in the soil, obviously. That goes up to plants. Okay, cool. I'm good. Soil, roots, plants. An animal walks along, eats the plant, becomes an animal. So that's how you go from dirt to beef, right? It's not that complicated. Same thing, so soil, where this is actually going, you got forest floor, nutrients that we talked about earlier going through the soil. Anyway, that's how you do it. Again, soil roots, same roots go to trees, becomes maple syrup, delicious. People becomes people, right? What is this really saying? We're all just dirt. It all comes from dirt. That's why you can't, around soil scientists, you can't call them you can't call it dirt. You guys remember that? You guys take the 310 class. Don't call it dirt around my buddy Jason. He'll get pissed. Anyway, all right.
You know what else it's saying is we don't excrete and we don't die.
What? Oh, at the top? We're perfect.
Yeah. How do we cycle back into the soil?
Oh, how much more? Okay, so you make a good point.
Well, it depends if you're cremated or not, right?
Well, what pisses me off is they make a distinction between people and animals. What's up with that? Yeah, that's just me. What did you say about deciding? I missed that other point.
Oh, I said it depends on whether you get cremated or not, right? Because if you're put in a casket, you're not going back into the soil.
Are we going to talk about the carbon thing again? That reintroduces heavy metals to the soil, which is toxicity. Yeah, now you get a point. All right. Anyway, whatever. The grass. Okay, so let's move on. Switching gears, describing. So this is what we're going to talk about most of the rest of the day. I just wanted to talk about ecology a little bit to have that baseline. So let's start talking about fire on the landscape. And we're going to talk about it through a couple measures. There's actually a few more we're going to talk about later, but the most important is fire regimes, and then there's also this thing called condition classes. I'm probably going to need to take this out of the presentation because Frcc, you'll see this. You guys might end up seeing this in your careers at some point where you need to determine what's called the Frcc. The Frcc is actually two different things. It's fire regime is the FR, and then the CC, the condition class, is something different, but a lot of times it gets lumped together. And the development of the fire regimes and the condition classes, it started with successional theories, and there's a lot of uses and limitations to it. Where the hell was I going with this one? Yeah, this is a slide I kind of manipulated. I think what I was trying to say is this Frcc concept, it comes from the National Fire Plan, so we're talking, 16 years ago? It's getting a little dated. The condition class simply talks about the departure, basically how out of whack an ecosystem is, which is different than a fire regime, which just talks about, what are the characteristics of it. And we're going to get into some detail here. And I don't remember what I was going to do with this. I know I'm going to change the slide, but I can't remember what my point was. I think the uses and limitations point, actually I'm going to talk about this. The uses and limitations of this is that both of them, especially condition class, are very difficult to determine just anecdotally. Just like it's really hard to go out to the landscape and just say, oh, that's a fire regime, whatever, that's a condition class, whatever. It takes a lot of data. It's very data intensive, and there's this whole process where you take the data, you take GIS data, you take field data, and you go and then you make a determination. You look at fire history, you look at the silvics of trees, and then you can make an actual determination of these things. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is from the limitation standpoint, it's really hard. And then they ask us all the time, like in the facts database for reporting, they're like, what's the condition class? You're probably familiar with this, right, in the reporting. Do you ever feel like you accurately can describe what the condition class is?
Well, I just go back to the old data and then look up whatever input was inputted.
Because the first person who entered it nailed it, right? And
That's all I got, man.
And I made this point though, that which is like we're managing to this condition class nationally. That's our congressional record, and none of us have any clue what the heck we're supposed to be putting. So that's probably outside the scope of the class, but it.
Well, we had a real smart forester, and then
Yeah.
chances are they probably know or have a more accurate description of our condition.
You talking about
class.
Kayana?
Yeah.
Yeah, she probably didn't know what the hell she was talking about. This will make. I should put this slide later because this will make more sense later. That's weird. Anyway, let's shift gears here. Let's talk about. Let's like actually start to really talk about these things. I think I might have meant to have that slide later in this lecture. So, all right, fire regimes. This is important stuff. Getting into the meat and potatoes here. So, what is a fire regime? That's the question. What is a fire regime? A fire regime is something that, as everything in nature, is extremely complicated. Okay? So it's, and I'm just going to paraphrase, it's a way to make it simple enough for us to be able to talk about it. It's a way for me to be able to say, hey, that looks like a fire regime 1, or that's a fire regime 2, or whatever, and you know what I'm talking about because we're talking about the same thing, right? We have a set definition. That's why we make definitions of things, so that we both are able to converse fluently. The definition is a way to categorize the natural processes that occur in an ecosystem as it relates to fire. So let's break that down. What's a categorization? To categorize something means what?
Grouping.
Yeah, to break it up into groups. And each one of those groups, obviously, and every time you have a category, has sideboards to it. So it's a way to identify sideboards. Are those sideboards going to include everything on a landscape? No, of course not, right? How narrow or wide those sideboards are, how do you think that relates to how, say, I hate to use this term, but how good the fire regime is, or how useful the fire regime is?
If it's too general, it's not that useful.
If it's too general, it's not that useful. Or,
Or the opposite. If it's too specific, then it doesn't give room to work.
yeah, either way. So there's trade-offs. Very good point. Let's remember that one. That's another one to pin. So it's going to be a categorization. Okay. Natural processes. We're not looking at disturbances. We're looking at the natural processes. So we're looking at those things that happen on the landscape. It's not necessarily saying a land-scattered tornado. It's talking about the processes that occur in an ecosystem. So we're talking about ecosystems, and of course, we're talking about fire. Obviously, it's a fire regime. I don't actually know if there's other types of regimes because I'm a fire person, but that would be a good question to ask. And really, like I said, just how fire fits into it. And it's a way for us to talk about it. So there's limits to it, obviously, because we have to pick those metrics, those sideboards we were just talking about. We have to pick which ones we want to use. And even to this day, probably we're not existing in a perfect, system. Our system that we use isn't that perfect. But it's what we have, and it's very complicated, so we're doing the best we can. So what's the purpose of having a fire regime? I think I just kind of discussed that a little bit. The purpose is so we can be able to discuss it, categorize it. But what would be the most important part of being able to describe a fire regime from a management standpoint?
Impact.
The impact. What do you mean by impact?
If you're trying to measure, are we talking like as I'm looking at it, or trying to describe it to somebody, or after the fact?
Really? Well, yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I do know what you mean. I think
Because one's more like an energy release, and the other one's more of an environmental impact. If you're looking at it after.
I got you. Well, let's pull it back a little bit, and let me rephrase the question to get to what I'm trying to get at is, so what would be the usefulness of having a fire regime? Like, what would be the usefulness for us as managers, as firefighters or whatever, fuels people, whatever, in being able to talk with each other about it?
Communication.
Communication. Obviously, you want to be able to communicate about it, but what are you communicating?
I'm taking a shot in the dark here, but
Yeah, it's over here.
fire regimes, it's got a lot to do with fire interval, right? And then from a management perspective, if you don't want to introduce fire too early because for like erosion
Yeah.
concerns, or for instance, and it goes back to you saying, there's a lot of data involved, but at least you'll have an idea of what you're doing as opposed to just, okay, more fire, more vegetation, more fire.
Exactly.
I guess you can gauge it more.
No, you're making the point. That's exactly right. Is if you're going to try to get from point A to point B, you have to know what point B is and point A is, right? So you're talking about a management action, and that's fundamentally what this comes down to. If you have to know what right looks like to be able to fix wrong, right? So if we know that we want our ecosystems of the Garner and Lagoon and Frcc to be a fire regime 1, we have to know what the hell that fire regime 1 is in the first place. And then we have to be able to identify it as being non-characteristic from that. So it's exactly what you're saying. In order for us to be able to do management actions and to be able to communicate those desired management actions, we have to have this set of variables that we can easily communicate and talk to each other about. It's a pretty simple concept, really, which is just you have to you have to have an agreed upon set of terms of what you're trying to get to. Like you said, if there's too many fires, then you're out of whack with the fire regime. You're not in that fire regime, so you need to do something different. Everybody follow that? So that's the real utility of having it, the purpose of having a fire regime. So we'll talk a little bit about the history. This guy, Bruce Kilgore, he was actually worked with Biswell, Harold Biswell, and the Sequoias and some of those. Ended up moving on to somewhere in Wisconsin with the state. Anyway, he took a stab back in '81, so pretty early. There was recognition. Remember what was going on in the late 70s, or 60s, 70s, and 80s? People were really starting to look at how fire interacts in the landscape, And so 10 years later, or so-ish, they wanted to be able to start to have some metrics about how to describe it in scientific papers and how to manage it too. So he took the first step, and actually I think he did a really good job. It's not what we use now, his descriptions, but he came up with what were called the fire regime factors. Okay, so this is another term. These are, and we've talked about some of these, some of you guys have brought some of these factors up, but these are components of fire regime. So fire frequency, what's fire frequency?
How many times does it happen? How often?
Over a set time period. Yes, but yes. How many times it's happened? Fire intensity, you guys know fire intensity?
How hot it burns?
Yeah. Intensity is simply a measure of heat release versus severity, which you get to. Seasonality? What's seasonality?
Time of the year.
What time it happened, or what time maybe something, we often talk about it in terms of the time something should happen. Burn pattern, you guys know what burn pattern is? Well, moonscape would probably be more referring to severity, but yeah. It's, you guys heard the term mosaic? Okay, so like homogeneous or heterogeneous burn. That's the burn pattern. Is literally it hopscotched around. It left some here. It left an island there. If you look at it over the aggregate, you look at it over the whole burn perimeter. That's the burn the burn pattern. The pattern of burn. So yeah, if it moonscaped it, then I guess the whole thing you could say that it was one pattern. And then severity. What's severity?
It's effect.
Damage?
It's effect.
Yeah, it is the effect, and it talks about damage. The definition is the magnitude of the change. So severity specifically refers to change, and it's the magnitude of the change. So it's not necessarily how hot it burned, it's the effect. You guys were right? But it's the effects of that burn. So did it moonscape? That would be high severity. Again, when people say severity, instantly change that word to change. Like high severity means high change. Makes sense? Low severity means low change. You can tell what it was. If it's a low severity burn, afterwards you can tell what that landscape was before. How many of you guys ever walked into a timbered stand that just got freaking nuked and had no idea what the trees were, like what the species of were, or basically you couldn't tell?
Yeah.
Right. Maybe you can tell from the adjacency, whatever. That'd be high severity, and that's part of the definition. Okay, so Kilgore came up with the factors, the fire regime factors. These are the same factors, and some others that we use to this day. So he nailed it. This guy Heinzelman came up with the first categorization of fire regimes based upon these factors and some other research. We don't use the Heinzelman, but I'm gonna bring it up just from a historical standpoint. What the heck? We'll come back to it. Anyway, so why is it important? Okay, yeah. So I keep asking these like sort of like hypothetical questions, or I always ask during the lecture anyway. I think we already answered this question. Why is it important and relevant to know this information? So you can manage to it, right? Yeah. Sorry, we already covered that. I told you before. I always get ahead of myself in these lectures because I know these lectures so well. I just keep asking the questions that come. So I apologize. And then, of course, we always believe in Sun Tzu principles. Know your enemy. It might not be your enemy, but it's at least the area that you're managing. So you know the thing that you're interacting with. So Sun Tzu principles. And then we already talked about this again. Those natural conditions provides a target for restoration. So if you know that you want to restore us to a fire regime 1 or fire regime 2, whatever, then you have to know what that target is, so that you can walk into it afterwards and be like, "Yep, nailed it. Fire regime 1, we're good." Okay, sorry. So anyway, Heinzelman collated the research. And the definition he gives here is a summary of fire history that characterizes an ecosystem. So we're introducing this term here, characterization. Let's table that for a minute. He's looking at fire history. Do you think the history of fire, which is just the fires that have occurred on the landscape, do you think that's always the best way to judge what should be there characteristically? Could ask this another way. If you just landed on a spaceship from a spaceship and looked at the last 30 years of fire in Southern California, could you make a good understanding of what the fire regime in Southern California should be?
I don't think so, because you need to see what it looks like without it.
Yeah, exactly. Because we know that we've changed that. We've affected some of these factors, right? Frequency, seasonality. Seasonality is a huge thing in Southern California. Yeah. So I'm not making a big point here, but he looked at fire history. But there is also some value. It really just depends on the scale. So, and you're making the point, all of you, which is that you have to look at the long term and you have to incorporate other factors. So a quote here, he said, not to set up a precise classification, but to make it possible to discuss important differences in the way fire influences ecosystems. So again, he's not looking for a lot of precision, but he is looking for a classification, and again, to be able to discuss the differences in a way that influences ecosystems. So more or less all he's saying is we want to be able to manage it. He developed it for the lake states, but he also made some it does have some applicability to western forests because there's some similarities. And these Heinzelmans contain a multi-level approach to fire types, which is more accurate in some ways because it allows there to be like multiple fire regimes in some areas, which is a pretty dynamic way of doing it. In other words, it's saying some areas might have more than one fire regime, even in the same area, or in a small area. And that's pretty specific, but we don't really use that much anymore because it can get pretty complicated in a hurry. And these are some of the species that he used as an example. I'll use the example of Doug fir as this multi-leveled approach to a fire regime. You guys familiar with interior Doug fir? Are you guys familiar with like the ecology of Doug fir, the fire ecology of Douglas fir? I can go through it a little bit. I know you guys have all been up in Oregon and Washington fighting fire, right? In Doug fir, Cascade Slopes. What kind of fire behavior have you seen in Douglas fir? Any idea? Or maybe you haven't. I don't know. I don't want to make assumptions.
All I know is when you're trying to burn it, it doesn't burn as well as the long needle, the litter. Anyway.
You're right. A lot of times it doesn't. It burns like a surface fire. It'll move around.
Right.
A lot driven by surface fuels, dead and down. Moss can be a pain in the butt.
Right.
Right. So that is a typical sort of like low intensity, low severity surface fire burn. But I don't know if you know this, but Douglas fir is also notorious for huge crank and crown fire runs because because it has that tight canopy, it happens on a very long time period. You know, you have to have like an extended period of drought, and then like sort of like that perfect lightning. If you take it from a characteristic standpoint, that perfect lightning ignition during that perfect time. So it happens on a much longer time period. But that is also normal. That's characteristic. And so that's an example of it's a two-layered, it's like a multi-level approach where both are okay. But that gets kind of complicated. And red pine and ponderosa pine both have that. So ponderosa pine typically has that low intensity, which we think about, but it also can have some areas of pretty high intensity fire and be okay. It's just that tends to be on smaller patch scales. So everybody follow that? So you can have two different fire regimes in the same area, but again, we don't really try to manage that anymore. We came up with these 7 regimes. You don't spend a lot of time. The only reason I bring this up is to show. Remember we talked about the sideboards? These are the sideboards that we're starting to get into. And the way you'll see fire regimes is numbered, is numerically. So for his, I think he had 7, yeah, it's 7. 7 actually goes through 6. It's 0 through 6, so 7. 0 is none or very little natural fire. 1 would be, let's break it down, infrequent, so it doesn't happen very often, light surface fires. So just a light, low severity, low intensity surface fire. And this is the interesting thing too, it talks about the fire type, and it also talks about the fire interval. And so light surface fires, more than 25-year return intervals. So you're not having a lot of fire, like every 25 years or so, and then when it even happens, it's not very intense. And that might be like that, Doug, for, I don't know, I've never really spent much time trying to describe ecosystems that I'm familiar with to these high salinity regimes, so I'm kind of pulling it off. If you guys can come up with some examples, please share. And then just down the list, so again, frequent light surface fires, so it's opposed to 1, right? So 1 is infrequent, number 2 changes to frequent light surface fires, and so 1 to 25 years. 3 is infrequent severe, so it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's pretty severe. And on down, you guys can read this, short return, and then it starts talking about where it is in the dimension, so crown fires and severe surface fires, but long intervals, and then long interval crown fires, and then you have greater than 300-year fire return intervals. Crown fires and severe surface fires. Most fire regimes, the longer it is between fires, the more severe the fire is going to be, just incidentally, right? You guys are probably familiar with that, the high elevation stuff. It doesn't burn very often. When it does, it goes. It's almost like it sort of like has to take advantage of the fact that the fire is even there.
But that also has to deal with how much dead, down, everything else that's building underneath it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It takes that long to get it. Well, what are some examples of some areas?
So basically just, you get all the needle cast, and I know there's sections that we've been in our area where we go in to do, fuels projects, whatever, and you're sitting there digging through 5-6 feet of duff,
Yeah.
trying to get to the soil.
Is it?
So, I mean, just if you look at those type of things, you look at, as you have your dead and down, nothing's getting cleared out. You're getting, whatever growth underneath, tight canopy spacing on top of.
A lot of times, yeah.
On top of all the saplings coming up, they're trying to force in, taking up space, lower, more of like a ladder fuel effect.
Yep, a lot of times there's ladder fuel stuff coming up. Yep, low crown base heights, you see a lot in those ecosystems.
Yeah, and it all just builds over those hundreds of years. And then you get to a point where now one little thing based on time of year, whatever, and now you're looking at, instead of a ground fuel fire that just kind of pushes through and cleans up, now you're looking at something that's more devastating, going to tear off with more intensity.
It's interesting you use the term devastating, though, because that's sort of like a qualitative measure.
Is that considered a
Well-
bad thing, or?
Well, so what would be the difference between a good thing or a bad thing from our standpoint?
If it happens
Qualitative
every
standpoint. 300
years, you'd probably be a good thing to clear some of that fuel out of there and have a big crown fire, right?
But the bad thing about it, though, is that the fact that now how many hundreds of years do you need to regenerate that?
But that's
That's life.
yeah, that's right. That's a good point. That's life. Remember what ultimately what should at least what we all agree now, because that's whatever our culture now believes in, is what should we be managing for?
Natural state.
The natural state, the characteristic state is what we call it. So if it burns every 300 years and it destroys it all, if you want to use the term destroy, let's try to start using terms like it burns with high severity. It's just a fact, right? It burns with high severity. We're not putting a qualitative measure on it like devastated or catastrophic fire. We're not doing those anymore. We're just going to do scientific measures. So it burns with high severity, and that falls within this fire regime.
It's characteristic. That's meeting our objective.
Yes, it might make the neighbors upset because they lose their view. But yeah, we as land managers, we're trying to move to that characteristic because that's culturally where we're at right now. Culturally, we're not trying to cut all the trees down to, go build houses in San Francisco or whatever. Make sense? Yeah.
So if you're returning it to the 300 year, so now you have all this urban interface that's intervened and pushed in, and now we burn all those homes down, we return it to normal state.
Well, that's the complicating factor.
Houses are just part of the fuel.
Maybe it's part of the fuel.
Houses can be excess fuel load on the landscape.
Within that 300 years.
I mean, you know what I mean? Like, really, they are. They're part of the fuel load on a landscape. And yes, you start to put those cultural values associated with it. So, yeah, and that you're talking about what sort of like undermines, if you really want to look at it, that distinction of pure fire ecology. It's very pie in the sky, sort of almost like the wilderness aspect of, yeah, we let the 300-year fire return interval thing go until it threatens something, and then we want to go intervene. That is the fundamental conflict of wildland fire management across the world. So, I mean, that's a real issue, and it just depends on what you want to talk about at this particular moment. Right now, I'm just explaining fire ecology. But yeah, if there happens to be a subdivision at the end of that 300-year fire interval, number 6 Heinzman fire regime, you as a land manager, you as a fire manager have to make those decisions. Do you let it burn or not? Do you interrupt that cycle? Keep thinking those thoughts. Okay, so the next iteration of this is the Hardy. I can't remember his first name, but anyway, it's a 2001 fire regime. So the Heinzman stuff were earlier in the 90s, if I recall. What also happened in 2001? Or 2001? Talk about it a lot. National Fire Plan, remember? It's so funny. It's real. So these are the fire regimes, even though they're from 2001, these are the ones we're managing to right now by congressional direction. So these are the ones you should actually pay attention to. So it's like when you go do facts reporting or whatever, these are the fire regimes that we're trying to manage to. And when we talk about just in general conversation about fire regimes, we're talking about the Hardy fire regimes. They replaced the Heinzman, and the important part is that they added the severity to it, which the other ones did not have severity. And severity is probably, well, I think severity is the most important metric. Right? We'll take a break. You guys good? We'll take a break at 11 or so. You guys good till then? Yeah. And then again, this is where the condition class metric comes into. We're going to talk about condition class afterwards. I used to explain it before, but I decided I wanted it this year, try to explain fire regimes first. So anyway, we use fire regime, and then condition kind of class helps sort of describe where you're at with the fire regime, but we'll get to that. So this is just, it's the same concepts, it's the same fire regime factors that we had talked about before, but what they do is, they're still a numeric, but it's listed as like the Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so there's 5 of them. And it's basically the same stuff going on, 0 to 35 years, so they're talking about that characteristic interval, anywhere from 0 to 35 years. Right, low to mixed severity. So severity, remember? What's severity?
How much of a change?
Change, degree of change, magnitude change. So low to mixed severity. What's mixed severity?
You can have some.
Kind of like the mosaic pattern you're
A
talking
little
about.
high, a little low, a little upper, a little downer.
It's not uniform.
Yeah, it's not uniform. It's rather mosaic, right? So mixed severity. So low to mixed severity, and then it's interesting. They put these this description at the end of every one of them to describe what that severity should look like. And it's interesting. So less than 75% of the dominant overstory vegetation is replaced. So that means 25% or less is basically burned up or moved or changed or whatever, right? So just a very light fire has come through. Fire regime 1. So fire regime 1, Jeffrey Pine, Mount Laguna, Fry Creek, Garner, Long Needle Pine, Ponderosa Pine. Those are fire regime 1s where you're getting that fire interval 12, it says 0 to 35, but you're talking about that 12 to 15 to 20 year fire return interval, where fire is a frequent and important part of the ecosystem. Those are fire regime 1s. These are the ones that are the easiest to manage, by the way, for the most part, because they're really kind of foolproof from a management standpoint. You get, you're just trying to get to that park-like setting. It's very easy to visualize that. You get rid of all the stuff that's grown up in the last 80 years, all the young trees, the ladder fuels. You retain the older tree species. You get to that spacing every 12 to 15 feet or so. Get rid of all that material, however, either drive it off the site or burn it or pile it or whatever. Wait a couple years, put a broadcast burn through it, you reset the ecosystem. That's why we've been so successful in restoring huge areas of the Pine Belt, the southwestern United States Pine Belt, the Coconino, the Tonto, the A-bar-S, a lot of those, although a lot of them are in wallow, as we all know. But that's why that 4 forest collaborative of those 4 forests in Southwest, it's just because I hate to say it, I'm not trying to denigrate it, but it's really pretty easy working out there. It's a good thing though, because it's an important habitat. Anyway, so fire regime 2, 0 to 35 years, so that's still that same frequency, but high severity. So it's interesting, right? So it's burning frequently and it's burning severely. A lot of change. Stand replacement, greater than 75% of the dominant overstory vegetation is replaced. What does that sound like? What kind of ecosystem or fuel model or whatever you want to use to describe it? Could you give me an example of?
Thomas fire?
No, it's not chaparral actually. But although it's moving to that fire regime, but is that characteristic? Actually, we'll come back to that. Grass. Grass. That's the point, right? Grass falls into this a lot. Because grass is a high severity fire, right? So grass is the dominant overstory vegetation, right? In like a prairie. And when grass burns, does 75% of it get replaced or burned?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, damn near 100% in most times. You're talking 80-90% of the grass will burn. So yeah, grass is a great example of that. The reason I laugh about the Thomas is like a lot of the chaparral is converting to that sort of fire regime, but it's not the characteristic fire regime. So, all right, 3, right in the middle, 35 to 100 years. This is sort of like the on-the-fence fire regime. 3 it's a mixed severity, so it's less than 75% of the dominant is going to get replaced, but somewhat long intervals, 35 to 100. It's kind of like, I really think of this as like that true sort of mixed conifer, but mixed severity fire environment. Can't even think of a good example right now. Can anybody think of a good example of that? I said mixed conifer, but the Tahoe?
No, they don't get big fires all the time, but when they do,
Yeah, I could see that. Actually, that sparked me to think maybe sort of like a grass with a timber overstory, or like a grass brush sort of understory with like maybe oak or something, where it goes through, but the overstory sort of stays intact. I don't know. I have to come up with a better example of that one. Actually, to go back to the Tahoe, I can see that though, because it's a lot of mixed type of conifer up there, right? You're getting more northern in the state. You get fires through there, a lot of surface fire, but it kind of torches probably in some areas. Yeah, I could definitely see that. Okay, we'll go with that.
maybe.
So, regime 4, same, 35 to 100 years, and then high severity, stand replacement. Fire regime 4.
So like Idaho, like some of the fires they put through, like the
Colorado.
potato complex or something, where you're damaging all the timber and it takes longer for that timber to come back.
Yeah, I could see some of it being in that, but actually, now that you mentioned it, I actually could probably see a lot of that being fire regime 3, because all that's that mixed conifer. We have a lot of mosaic on the landscape, a lot of it stays intact. But Great Basin, I could see I could see it more being in fire regime 4.
Because I was just saying, like, just from my experience, was like on the Red Mountain fire
Yeah.
in Idaho, it was
Yep.
just nuking off all the timber, And so, I mean, if you look at the interval change,
Well, that's a question, because you're looking at one fire in one scenario, and in 2006, when the red burned, we had been in drought for that year. So that's why you can't look at one fire and determine a fire regime. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't actually know for sure. I can't remember. I want to say it's actually more of 3 up there. But again, you can't just look at that. It's like that alien landing on Earth and looking at one fire and trying to determine the fire regime. You have to look at the data. You have to look at the tree species and how they react. So just because you see one burn that gets nuked off doesn't mean it's the way it's supposed to be burned.
well, because we drove through from that fire, we drove over to another area that had burned like 10 or 15 years prior.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the name of it, but all it was a bunch of sticks still standing with some grass and weeds and little vegetation underneath it. And that was, they said that was like 5 or 6 years prior.
Really? Yeah, and I just read something recently about the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, which is right north of there, not too far from the Salmon Chalice. And I guess they're having a lot of severity and a lot of stand loss. But I don't know if that's characteristic or not. But they put a lot of fire into the Frank Church, right? So they just let it burn a lot of time. Not let burn, but they manage their fires a lot. I don't know. Let's talk about 4, though. What's the best characteristic fuel model or ecosystem of 4?
I would think like lodgepole. Maybe chaparral.
Yeah, actually, I think lodgepole would be a good example of that. And chaparral is is the best example around here. Yeah, chaparral falls solidly into 4. And lodgepole, as we talked about, mimics chaparral a lot, right? It doesn't burn often, but when it does, it gotta go, and it's gotta burn hot. So good point. So 4, yep, chaparral is 4, should be managing to that. And then 5, it's 200 plus, so it doesn't have that 300-year metric, it's 200 plus. It's the same thing as that 6 we talked about with high severity. So it doesn't burn often, but when it goes, stand replacement. So those are the 5 that we're managing for now, or at least we're using as our sideboards that we talked about currently. This is just a recap. 1, 0, you can see it's 0 to 35, then you got 35 to 100, 2 of those, and then high. I find this personally interesting that 3 of the 5 are in the high category, high severity category. 4th is mixed, which is like a little bit high, and then only 1 is a low severity regime. What does this mean?
Fire.
It means that most fire regimes are a high fire severity. So like we attribute, or we, culturally look at high severity fire as a negative. We always use terms like catastrophic fire, devastating fire, this and that. Whereas in reality, if you break it down and look at the fire regimes, 3 of the 5, maybe 3.5 of the 5 are actually supposed to be high severity, characteristically, like supposed to be normally, which is kind of interesting, right? You
Got a question.
Just ask a question.
When it comes to trying to gauge and measure high severity and stand replacement so that you can categorize it into a fire regime. Now, what are we talking like? Is there like a set standard for maybe within a 1 mile radius, 10 mile radius, 100 mile radius?
For like the scale of the area that is like the fire regime falls within, you mean?
Yeah, it's like trying to measure the condition class in the fire regime, and it's like, okay, and we're talking about, okay, if 75% of the major overstory was replaced, but...
No, I got you. That's a great question. There's a couple ways to answer that. The first one is like if you look at the land fire, which is a GIS database, which you'll probably see tomorrow, I would imagine, knowing Dan. It does it to like, it breaks it down pretty small. It fragments it quite a bit, like maybe like 5-10 acres at a time. There might be some differences. But the real answer, I think, is it comes down to the fuel model and the fuel type, the vegetation type that's there. So any chaparral. So if you look at the landscape, right? So the chaparral, it's not from the coast all the way, right? There's rivers that go through. There's big grass fields. Each one of those can have its own sort of fire regime. Or you could look. I mean, it would probably be inappropriate to say all of Southern California is full, right? It's all of the chamise and chaparral, manzanita is for primarily. All the grasslands are probably 1 because they probably burn. And you get into like, why is it there? Is it there because of humans? Is it there naturally? Is it a soil thing that's making it be grass? It's mostly dependent upon the tree. If it's trees or a forest, it's that either an individual species or a collection of species that create that fire regime. I think I'm probably doing a poor job of explaining it, but it really goes down to the fuel model. It goes down to the vegetation type that you can then ascribe that fire regime to. Because, right, to have a fire regime, you have to have something that's going to burn. It's going to be burn, it's going to be the woody fuel, and that woody fuel is the vegetation. So it all ties back to what is the actual vegetation on the landscape. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
It's you. There's really no set answer. I guess that's probably the better way to answer it. There's really no set answer of scale. But what I've seen it just follows the actual vegetation that's on the landscape.
Because like when it comes to the fuel breaks or projects, it's like Strawberry South, for instance, it's 45 acres. So that's kind of easy to categorize because you're looking within that perimeter. But
Depends on the fuel model. It will change the regime. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. Model is not, a fuel model is would not be my first choice of describing something. I would look at it more like a vegetation type, because a fuel model can be fuel. So let's talk about fuel model 4. I think it's 4, right? Chaparral, typically Chaparral. So fuel model 4, the old fuel models, and we're going to do a whole fuel models lecture, which is actually my favorite one. So fuel model 4, the old ones, is Chaparral, but if you look at the book, by definition, a slash or what do you call it, the dead and down, the 11, 12, and 13, the logging slash. Logging slash with red needles attached to it is fuel model 4. So you wouldn't think that chaparral and logging slash with red needles is the same. So it's a different vegetation, but it's the same fuel model. See the difference I'm trying to make? So fuel model is not analogous to vegetation. In other words, you can't just say this fuel model is always this vegetation type, because it depends on the structure of the vegetation. So like an aspen stand, I'm getting into a fuel model lecture here, but an aspen stand that is 15 years old is going to be wildly different fuel model than an aspen stand that's 110 years old, because of all that dead and down and the things that contribute into what makes a fuel model. Make sense, guys? Okay. So I want to go back to, I have this is actually from our Palomar field trip packets, and I want to see if the maps, that's the burn plan. Let me see if I got the maps.
Those regimes would also just, could they be area specific?
Area specific?
Yeah.
No, it's not going to be time, because that might change over time.
Because like I know
I
like
mean, longer than time.
well I know like typically for like a brush component every 35 years, but in some areas like with coastal influence it grows back faster. Therefore, you have a quicker interval of years versus tens of years type of thing. So again, I kind of digress to living in Malibu, but
It's okay.
but every 5 years to 6 years, typically, we would have a fire that would push through and be large in nature. And we had back in '78, we had 80, 84, I think. Then we had 88. Then we had 92. We had 96. And it was all the same land that was burning over again. And the brush was back up to 6-7 feet within that period of time.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you have all that coastal moisture that was pushing in. So,
But your question was,
well, could it be?
can we tie to an area?
Yeah,
I still would say no. It really depends on.
because usually you would have that component, that brush component of a 35-year
Right.
return rate, and now it's within a 5 to 6 year return rate.
Here's a way of looking at it. So you have San Diego City down there, right along the bay.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's all paved over, it probably technically still has a fire regime associated with it, which is what should be growing there if they hadn't have paved the city. And so if we all went away in 5,000 years Probably what's going to be growing there is the stuff that would have been growing there, is the coastal sage scrub. The same stuff in Malibu that you're talking about. So, but that's still not tied to the area per se. It's tied to the climatic factors. It's tied to the vegetation that normally grows there. It's so I don't know, man. Maybe
I was just looking at it in return rate, like in the fact that, typically it's every 35 years, you're getting that fire that pushes through because it's at whatever height and loading and all that, but, because of some other influences, you were getting a quicker return rate on fire and...
okay, so you're changing the frequency of the fire.
Mm-hmm.
But what's your question about that, though?
So
Does
my
that
question
change the fire regime?
could it be environmentally affected based on location versus Southern California per se?
Okay, there's probably a couple ways to answer that, but the fire regime would only change if the climate itself changed and then the vegetation changed. Then you would probably have a new normalized fire regime. But that would take eons. It takes a very long time period. Who knows with climate change and everything going on and how long it's actually going to take. But yes, with these large, long-term climactic scale type things, that would be really the only thing that could change the fire regime. But the fire regimes have been the same for like 10,000 years, more or less, because the vegetation hasn't changed. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
All right. Well, let's keep exploring it. This is, I thought I had this document to try to answer the question about the fire regimes. This is the land fire data, which you pull from GIS, and this has, you might recognize this is the one for I'll keep this up, we're going to take a break. You can come and look. This is just, this is just Fry Creek, so you're talking an area of 500 acres up here. And you can look at all the different fire regimes, and this is like why I had a packet that I print out for you guys when we actually get to do a field trip, which for some reason we can't seem to do this here, to actually show you this. And it's interesting to take this land fire data. So you're talking about, this is all broken up, so you have a 1 right next to a 4. I mean, these are somewhat arbitrary definitions, but what is going to be the difference between this 1 and this 4?
Your characteristics.
If you go look at it.
It could be any factor.
Well, what's it going to be? How do they map this? I guess is what I'm asking.
Fire history.
There could be some fire history associated with it.
Aspect.
No, it's vegetation. Vegetation differences. So this fire regime 1, what's probably there?
Grass.
No, that's a 2.
No, timber.
1's going to be timber frequent surface fire versus this 4. What's 4? Brush. You have this is going to be a timber line right here where 1 meets this 4. This is that Canfield Road, for those of you guys that know it, where you have the timber comes down and you start getting into that mineral hall aspect. This is literally a vegetation change. And you can see it reflected in this fire regime change. So,
Cool.
come take a look at it. Does that make that help
Yeah.
clarify
Yeah,
things a
that
little bit?
helps a lot.
That's why I'm saying it's not 4 for all of this.
Alright.
It's tied back to the vegetation. All right, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll push probably maybe 4 minutes. You guys good? All right, good stuff. Thank you. Good one.
See, what you need here are one of those GIS maps of our burn areas, so you know specifically, so when you categorize them.
Working on it.
Okay. Anyway, so trees especially, right? Some trees, it can take decades or more for them to get to a point where they can actually reproduce and create more seed and new trees and that sort of thing. So obviously it matters to them, and so they actually grow up and they have a specific vegetative life cycle that's associated with how often fire comes through. Chaparral is another example where chaparral, it can handle recurrent fire. It doesn't want to burn too often though, because it'll deplete those reserves in its roots that allow it to resprout. Okay? All right. And that's a term that we're going to introduce here also called truncated. Truncated definition just means cut off. So we're going to come back to this, but there's truncated fire regimes in this and non-truncated fire regimes. And that really just refers to how well the plant responds to that fire return interval, whether it can have too much fire, and then on the converse, some plants require fire, otherwise it's not going to be successful reproducing. So in general, and this is just in general, if you have too short of a fire return interval, your reproductive strategies are affected, so it doesn't have enough time to be able to produce seed and sprout or reproduce, to produce seed or to regenerate itself. When there's too much fire, you get a lot of invasive species that come in. That's that type conversion that we talk about a lot. If there's too much fire. And then fire-driven conversion, well, that's actually, I just said that. So type conversion and then invasive species. So remember that term used earlier, pioneer species? Pioneer species are these, it tend to be weeds, frankly. And weeds is a qualitative term that we use anyway, which is saying that we don't want that plant. But any weed is just a plant, and the plants have areas where they like to grow, and some plants grow better in those harsh environments right after fire had burned through or whatever. Some plants do better growing in a crack in the concrete. It's because they're a weed and they're able to thrive in those areas. Oftentimes when there's too much fire, you get those invasive species coming in. And that tends to be a problem because then you don't have those characteristic normal plants, right? What do they call those plants? There's a term for it. Plants that should be on the landscape instead of invasive?
Indigenous?
Native?
Yeah, native plants, right? So I'm trying to keep you engaged here. Yeah, native plants or indigenous is a good one too. Yeah, they can replace the native plants. Or on the converse, if there's too long of a fire return interval, same thing. Reproduction strategies can be affected. You can be like, all right, I need a fire already, right? Those serotinous species, those like lodgepole pine, it gets to a point where it's like, okay, I need a fire already. I need to get rid of my overstory mass and open up these seed cones. Get going with the next generation. You can get a fuels accumulation. What happens with an accumulation of fuels? We all know that story, right? You get what happens when you burn through a stand with too much of a fuels accumulation.
Higher intensity.
Intensity
But
and
it'll kill out the
severity.
Severity.
Severity is really what we're interested in. Intensity can lead to severity. Yeah. I'm
Bigger change.
being nitpicky.
Bigger change.
Yes, there's a higher degree of change frequently because of intensity, which is energy release. That energy release results in change. And then you just get a conversion away from historic vegetative conditions. So these are, again, consequences of either too short or too long of a fire return interval. And these are just some examples of some characteristic fire return intervals. I think I pulled this from the OMI book. I love this book, Forest Fires by Phil OMI. It's a textbook. So alpine tundra in New England, fire return interval. You don't often think of fires in the tundra of New England, but it has an associated fire return interval. It's just that it's 1,000 years plus. They don't really know. They know it's at least 1,000 years. They can, they look at like charcoal dating, so they can tell that there's been fires there, just very, very infrequently. The conditions that support fire, not really prevalent, and probably not super important to the landscape. White spruce up in Alaska, like way up there, 200 years. And you get lodgepole in Montana anywhere from 25 to 150. This Sierra Nevada lodgepole is actually a different subspecies which doesn't require fire like say the Yellowstone Montana lodgepole. It's not as serotinous. It actually has a much longer fire return interval. Palustres, which is longleaf pine, that's a 3-year fire interval. And some of the research says a 1-year fire return interval. It's good with fire every year. It's totally good with it. Sequoias 10 to 100, hard chaparral, deciduous chaparral, and evergreen, 50 to 100. Actually, I refute. There's a lot of. I don't think science has really come down one way or the other on what the actual fire return interval for chaparral should be, but it's generally agreed to between 30 to 100 years or so. And then, prairie. Every year, a lot of these areas in the prairie, characteristically, there's not much of this left. It really did burn every year, or maybe every other year.
There's things in the chaparral.
And then rainforest. We don't actually, in this book it talks about, we don't actually really know. We know that there's a fire return interval to it, but we don't have evidence of it, because everything does burn. Steve Pine has this book called World Fire, which is an interesting book if you ever want to read one. And one of the theses in that book, World Fire, is that every landscape on Earth has a fire regime, has a fire return interval. We might not have a full understanding of it, But everything, even Antarctica, has a fire return interval. It's just Antarctica is currently under, 5 miles of ice. But at one point it wasn't, and it probably had fire on it. And maybe someday it'll melt and it'll return. So it might be a fire return interval of, hundreds of thousands of years. But the point is, that's an extreme example, but the point is that everything has a fire return interval. And anything that's wood can burn, will burn. So
What's the name of that book?
it's called World Fire. I got a copy of it if you want. I like that book because it actually talks about fire in like Siberia and Indonesia and Africa and the U.S. of course. World Fire. Okay. For lunch, you guys want to take an early lunch? If you want to get out, I know sometimes it's easier to get out into Ramona before noon.
Yeah.
Would that be easier? I'm just going to keep going through this. If not, what do you say?
That's fine.
Yeah.
I want feedback. I know it's a little bit early. I don't know if you're even hungry or not yet.
I'm always hungry.
Okay. How much time do you want? At least 45 minutes, probably.
45 minutes an hour.
Conditions, maybe.
Yeah, conditions. Well, let's say an hour. If you guys are here before then we'll just start. So let's shoot for 12:30. If you're here before, then we get out earlier. So it's up to you guys. All right, let's just do that. I think I'm sensing you guys fading a little bit, so you can get some burritos in your belly and we'll come at it again.
Don't be that
I
guy.
have the rest of my
Yeah, I want.
I'm fine.
I was just gonna say if you don't